The throne of Castile is vacant. A 15-year-old young man will assume the power of the crown, but soon all the nobility will hate and fear him in equal measure. His own mother will be forced to flee from him. A young man who will become a bloodthirsty man, a man who will cry out for vengeance and fill the crown with corpses. No one is safe from the king, no one is secure. Friends or enemies, anyone can die. A psychopath has taken the throne. Upon the death of Alfonso XI, the justiciar, the throne passed to Pedro, the king's 15-year-old son. However, not all was well. Get ready for the conspiracies that are about to come. His mother, Maria of Portugal, along with Portuguese nobleman Juan Alfonso de Albuquerque, protected Pedro's interests. But there was another side. Opposing them was Leonor de Guzman, Alfonso XI's lover for almost 20 years, with whom he had 10 children. She wanted to gain more power for herself and her children, not necessarily the throne. And as if that weren't enough, we have a third faction. Another one, Leonor, who was the sister of Alfonso XI and had 2 sons, Juan and Fernando, so both of them were cousins of Pedro I of Castile. We'll call them the Aragonese bloc, since Leonor was the widow of the late King of Aragon, Alfonso IV. Let's get started now that you have the context. As soon as Alfonso XI died, Maria, his widow, ordered the arrest and imprisonment of Leonor and all her children, more as a personal act of revenge. This pleased most of Castile, who disapproved of the rise of Leonor's illegitimate children. However, it wouldn't be easy. 2 of Leonor's sons, one of them Federic, Master of the Order of Santiago, and the other Enrique, Count of Trastamara. Watch out, Count of Trastamara. They found out and took up arms before being arrested. In addition, his mother managed to have Enrique marry the daughter of Don Juan Manuel, whom we met in a previous episode. So they gained a great deal of property and influence. Maria, fearing a civil war, freed Leonor. But big problem? In August of the year 1350, the young Pedro fell seriously ill. Of course, in the palace, they began to look for a successor. And who was the best for the position? Fernando of Aragon, son of Leonor and Alfonso IV of Aragon. You don't know this yet? But Fernando had to run away from Aragon after Pedro arrived, the ceremonious to the throne, and of course the ceremonious. When he found out that Fernando was claiming the throne, he panicked. Castile was militarily superior to Aragon, so if Fernando was crowned king, he could use his Aragonese blood as a casus belli to claim the throne and conquer the crown of Aragon. And then another candidate emerged, Juan Núñez III de Lara, a descendant of Alfonso II through the Infantes de la Cerda. Do you remember these? I'll leave the video link here. They were officially the true heirs to the throne of Alfonso X, but after a civil war they lost their rights. Well, now they were claiming them. And then there was a turn of events. The young Pedro overcame his illness, and now he knew the names of his enemies inside the palace. Those who were dividing up the crown in anticipation of his death. As soon as he recovered, Pedro and his mother decided to imprison Leonor, the former lover of the king, thinking that by doing so, they would cut off one of the factions. And in fact, after the execution of Leonor in the year 1351, Enrique de Trastamara fled to Portugal with Leonor's faction shattered. It was the turn of Juan Núñez de Lara, who had put himself forward for the crown. Pedro's armies entered Biscay like a whirlwind and crushed the rebel forces. Curiously, Juan died of natural causes, and so did his 3-year-old heir. Or at least that's what the chronicle says. For now, the crown of Castile was at peace. In fact, Pedro forgave the uprising of Enrique de Trastamara, who returned from exile and took refuge in his estates in Asturias. And what did he do once he was there? Well, he gathered an army and rebelled against the crown. However, he wasn't a real threat at the time. In the year 1353, Pedro married Blanca de Bourbon from the French royal family. But here comes a chapter straight out of a soap opera. 2 days after the wedding, the king ordered her to be locked up in the Alcazar of Toledo. But why would he do this? Well, because the monarch was madly in love with Maria de Padilla, a young Castilian lady. Of course, it's not a big deal for the king to have a lover, that's something common. But he was supposed to keep up appearances, not lock up his wife and live his life with his lover. This enraged a large part of Castile, and once again it was divided into two factions. On one side, the king's mother Maria, the noblemen of Albuquerque and most of the Castilian nobility. The king of Aragon, Enrique de Trastamara, who didn't matter because he was already in open rebellion. Pedro and the king of France. All of them supported Blanca de Bourbon, supporting the king. There was the lesser nobility, the Jewish community, and very importantly, the bourgeoisie. Why the bourgeoisie? Because Pedro had been giving more power to the towns at the expense of the nobility, aiming to eliminate noble powers. The Queen Mother did not want the crown to break apart, so she asked Pope Innocent VI to intercede for her. Indeed, he convinced Pedro to meet with Blanca. Actually, he threatened him with excommunication. If he didn't do it, Pedro met with his wife in Valladolid. But again, 2 days later, he left and turned the palace upside down. And that's the whole palace. All the high officials of the court and the masters of the military orders were dismissed and replaced by relatives of Maria de Padilla, his lover. He also ordered attacks on the positions of the Valido de Albuquerque, who had to flee to Portugal. Anticipating a counterattack, Pedro ordered the Trastamara to defend the Portuguese border. But of course, since he didn't trust them either, he ordered a brother of his lover, Juan Garcia, recently appointed Grand Commander of the Order of Santiago, to keep an eye on the Trastamaras as well. In the year 1354, Pedro got married again, this time to Juana, a Galician woman, which made things even more complicated. However, in an attempt to calm things down, a meeting was arranged near Zamora to reach an agreement. Each side attended the meeting, and there the king realized that the crown was slipping out of his hands. Fernando of Aragon, son of the late Alfonso IV and cousin of the king of Aragon, was gaining more and more support among the nobility. Enrique de Trastamara was becoming stronger, while Maria, Pedro's mother, was with the Duke of Albuquerque. They were pulling strings so that a son of the King of Portugal, who had the blood of Sancho IV, would ascend to the Castilian throne. A huge mess. And to make things even more complicated, the Trastamaras, besides supporting themselves, also supported the son of the King of Portugal, who, by the way, is also named Pedro Bueno. Well, it turns out that when Pedro Ferrer of Castile arrived at the meeting, he realized it was a trap. They treated him with respect, yes, but in reality he was trapped. They didn't leave him unsupervised, and he wasn't allowed to leave Zamora under the excuse of resolving the problems that existed in the crown. His own mother took the opportunity to have the Pope annul Pedro's marriage to Juana, so that he would only be married to Blanca. The origin of the crown's problems? Bad situation for the king, who nevertheless managed to escape in the autumn of that same year thanks to the support of his treasurer, the Jew Samuel Levy. And ladies and gentlemen, the devil has escaped from his cage. That same autumn, the former favorite Albuquerque, his mother's main supporter, died from poisoning. In December, Pedro arrived in Burgos, where he summoned the Cortes to provide him with support, an army with which to crush the noble rebellion that was against him. In April of the year 1355, some of the main rebellious nobles were killed by order of the king, who sought to put an end to the noble rebellion at its root. However, this, rather than calming things down, stirred them up to the point that Toledo, the old capital of the Visigothic kingdom and jewel of the crown, rose up in favor of Blanca de Bourbon, joining the rebellious nobles. Take a look at this. A town that is usually on the opposite side of the nobility is supporting the same cause as the nobles. But it was a bad choice. The King of Castile arrived and crushed the rebels. Among others, he executed the 2 knights who led the uprising and 22 townspeople who had shown too much enthusiasm in supporting his wife. From there, he went to Toro, where he entered with blood and fire, executing anyone who stood in his way. He would not leave any enemy alive. Forgiveness was a thing of the past. During the following years, he would continue with his own personal slaughter. He executed Fadrique and Tello of Castile, both brothers of Enrique de Trastamara. He executed Leonor of Castile, former Queen of Aragon, as well as one of her sons, and the list goes on. In fact, Enrique de Trastamara was forced to abandon his rebellion and go into exile. Where to? Well, to a kingdom that had enough power to, in the future, help him take the throne. France. Also remember that Blanca de Bourbon had French royal blood. The king's mother also fled from the crown and returned to her birthplace, Portugal, where she ended up dying of natural causes. In the year 1357, the slaughter finally seemed to bear fruit, as his opponents were disappearing. But it seems that madness is slowly taking hold of the monarch. He ordered an ox to be brought to his Burgos residence. The heads of 6 knights whom he had condemned to death in Seville, with the sole purpose of contemplating them. But the list of corpses kept growing. Among others, he ordered the execution of Samuel Levy. And does that sound familiar to you? He is the Jewish treasurer who had helped him escape when he was held hostage by Blanca's side in Zamora. Thus we arrive at the year 1359, in which Maria de Padilla, the king's lover, finally gave birth to a son, a true heir. He would be named Alfonso, but there is a problem. Juana, Pedro's Galician wife, had already given him a son who would be the legitimate heir. However, Pedro preferred to name the son of Maria de Padilla as his heir. In this way, we have a king in Castile, Pedro, now nicknamed the Cruel. We have an aspirant to the throne, Enrique de Trastamara, who is exiled in France. We have Juana's son, Juan, a possible heir to the throne of Castile, and an official heir but a bastard in some way, Alfonso. The curious thing is that both heirs were the result of unions that the Pope considered null. All wrong. In his madness and bloodthirstiness, Pedro conceived one last maneuver to solve all his problems: to execute Blanca de Bourbon, his first wife, and in the eyes of the king, the cause of all the problems the crown was facing. In the year 1361, Blanca de Bourbon, at 22 years old, was murdered. Immediately, Pedro I de Castilla proclaimed that Maria de Padilla was to be the Queen of Castilla. However, that same year, she died, a victim of the plague, plunging the king into a deep sorrow that left him quite emotionally unstable. He summoned the Cortes in Seville, where he declared that his only love had been Maria de Padilla, and he managed to have the Cortes of the crown annul his other marriages and name Maria Queen. Post-mortem, what for? Aside from trying to ease his pain with this tribute to his beloved. In this way, Alfonso was no longer a bastard, but became the true heir to the crown. Good, right? Well, no. In the year 1362, Alfonso died. So the only heir left was Juan, the son from his marriage to Juana, which had just been declared null by the courts of Seville. So he would no longer be a legitimate heir. Wow, what a mess, right? Allow me now to give you the context for everything that's happening. Because yes, Pedro was very cruel, but it wasn't that unusual either. At the time, Europe was burning mainly because the 100 Years' War between France and England was raging. It was a time when everyone was willing to kill their neighbor to save their own life. In fact, Enrique de Trastamara also carried out several massacres, mainly in the Jewish quarters of Castile, since the Jews had mostly supported Pedro I of Castile. What's more, while some called him Pedro the Cruel, others called him Pedro the Just. And what will happen now? Well, we have a Pedro in Castile, another in Aragon, France, and England at war, the peninsula completely unstable, and a war brewing. In the next episode, we will learn about the War of the Two Pedros.